The porch light flickered twice before it steadied, and in that thin yellow glow I saw my son sitting on the cold concrete step, knees pulled to his chest, hugging the blue blanket he had slept with since he was 2 years old. He was shivering, not the small shiver of a chilly evening, the deep, full-body shiver of a child who had been outside far longer than anyone should have let him be. The front door of my in-laws' house was locked. From inside, I could hear the television playing, laughter, ice clinking in glasses, normal sounds, sounds that did not belong next to a 5-year-old boy sitting alone in the dark. I stood frozen on the sidewalk in my dress blues, home only 40 minutes from a change of command ceremony at Naval Station Norfolk, my orders still folded in my coat pocket, and for one terrible second, I could not make my legs move. Then Liam looked up. His gray-blue eyes found mine, and he didn't cry out, didn't run to me. He just whispered the same 3 words he always used when he was trying to hold himself together. Mama, cold, sorry. Sorry. My son was apologizing for being cold, for being locked outside his grandparents' house. I would learn within the hour that the small black camera bolted above that door had been recording the entire time. They didn't know that yet. I need to back up, because you should understand who Liam is before you understand what they did to him. My name is Olivia Morgan. I'm a commander in the United States Navy, currently serving as Executive Officer of Destroyer Squadron 26 out of Norfolk. I have spent 18 years in uniform. I have stood watch in the Arabian Gulf, coordinated humanitarian relief after typhoons, and once talked a panicked 19-year-old sailor through a flooding compartment over a radio that kept cutting out. None of that prepared me for the fear that comes with raising a child alone. My husband, Marcus, was a Marine Corps helicopter pilot. He died 3 years ago in a training accident off the coast of California. Liam was 2. He doesn't remember his father's voice, only the framed photograph of a man in a flight suit, smiling like he had nothing to hide from the world. Liam was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder shortly after his 3rd birthday. He is gentle, bright, and specific about the world in ways that make him easy to love once you take the time to understand him. Fluorescent lights hurt his eyes. Loud, sudden noise makes his whole body flinch like static passing through him. He needs warnings before transitions. 5 minutes until dinner, 2 minutes until bath, 1 minute until we turn off the show. Give him that, and he is calm, curious, funny in a dry, specific way that catches people off guard. Deny him that structure, and the world becomes something he has to survive rather than live in. My in-laws, Richard and Diane Whitefield, never accepted the diagnosis. He just needs discipline, Richard told me once over a Thanksgiving dinner I nearly walked out of. In my day, we didn't coddle children. We taught them to toughen up. Diane was worse, in the quiet way some people are worse. She smiled while she said cruel things, so that if you objected, you were the one who looked unreasonable. You've made him soft, Olivia, she told me once, watching Liam rock gently in his chair, a self-soothing motion his occupational therapist had explained to them in detail, twice. Boys need structure, not all this accommodating. I had asked them more than once, gently and then not so gently, to respect his routines when he stayed with them. No sudden loud noises, no forcing eye contact, no punishing him for stimming, no isolating him as discipline. They always said yes. They never meant it. 6 weeks before that night on the porch, Diane called me at the squadron, something she rarely did since my hours were long and unpredictable. "Olivia, dear, I know you're terribly busy," said Diane in the voice she used when she wanted something. "Richard and I would love to have Liam for a sleepover this weekend. Just the 2 of us, some quality grandparent time. You work so hard. Let us help."
I should have said no. Some part of me, the part that had spent 18 years learning to read a room, already didn't trust the offer. But I had a training exercise that weekend that would keep me at the base past midnight 2 nights running, and my usual sitter, a Navy spouse named Priya, who understood Liam's needs perfectly, was traveling. I was exhausted, and they were his grandparents, and I wanted badly to believe that family meant something. Just Friday night, I told Diane. I'll be back Saturday morning. And Diane, please, his weighted blanket, his noise-canceling headphones, his visual schedule. He needs them. Of course, she said. We'll take wonderful care of him. I packed his bag myself. The blue blanket, the headphones, the laminated schedule card with pictures of a toothbrush, a bed, a sun rising. I drove him to their house in Chesapeake myself, knelt down at his level in their driveway, and told him the thing I always told him before a transition. I'll be back tomorrow morning, buddy. Grandma and Grandpa's house, then home. You're safe. He nodded, holding his blanket, and walked inside without looking back, which was how I knew he was anxious. Liam always looked back when he felt safe. I didn't know yet that it would be the last time I trusted them unsupervised. Saturday morning, I arrived at 8 sharp as promised. Diane answered the door already dressed for church, her smile a little too bright. He had a wonderful time, though he was a bit difficult at bedtime. Difficult how? Oh, fussing, crying about the lights being too bright, refusing to sleep with that blanket smelling sour. Richard had to be firm with him.
Something cold moved through my chest. Firm how, Diane? We just told him he needed to calm down on his own for a bit. 5 minutes in his room with the door shut. It worked wonders. He was asleep within the hour. 5 minutes with the door shut. For a child whose sensory system could spiral into genuine panic over unexpected darkness or silence was not discipline. It was isolation used as punishment, and it could undo months of careful, patient work his therapist and I had built together. Liam came out from the living room, blanket in hand, and when he saw me, he ran. Actually ran, and buried his face in my dress uniform jacket, not saying anything, just holding on. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, crouching down. "I'm here. We're going home." In the car, he was quiet for a long time. Then, staring out the window, he said, "Grandpa said the dark isn't scary. He said I'm being a baby." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went pale. That night, after he was asleep, I called my sister, Emily, who lives 40 minutes away in Chesapeake and has always been the person I call when I need someone to tell me I'm not overreacting. "They locked him in a dark room to make him stop crying," Emily said. "That's not discipline. That's cruelty dressed up as tough love." "Have you told them straight out? No games, no politeness, just told them it stops now?" "I have, multiple times. They nod and then they do whatever they want anyway because in their minds, I'm the overprotective single mother who coddles her broken child. Marcus used to run interference with them. I don't have that anymore." "Then maybe," Emily said carefully, "it's time they stopped having him alone." I told myself I would limit contact. I told myself the next visit would be supervised, brief, public, a lunch, not an overnight. I did not yet know that Diane and Richard had already decided, in the quiet arrogance of people who believe their age and their blood relation entitled them to override a mother's instructions, that they knew better than I did how to raise my son. I did not yet know about the doorbell camera Richard had installed the previous spring, the one he'd bragged about at a family barbecue as the best $200 I ever spent, catches every squirrel that touches my flower beds. I would come to think of it, later, as the only honest witness in that entire family. 3 weeks passed. I kept Liam away from Chesapeake, using the training schedule as my excuse, though the real reason sat heavier in my chest than any exercise ever had. Then Diane called again, this time with Richard's 68th birthday as the occasion. "It's a family dinner, Olivia. Nothing overnight, just a few hours. Surely you can bring him for that."
I nearly said no, but my mother-in-law's voice on the phone had an edge I recognized from years of Navy wardroom politics. The edge of someone who has already decided you will do what they ask and is simply waiting for you to catch up to that reality. Refusing outright would become, in the family narrative, proof that I was keeping Liam from his grandparents out of spite, out of my own damage, out of anything except the truth. And there was another reason, one I didn't examine closely enough at the time. My command master chief, a steady, sharp-eyed man named Senior Chief Alvarez, who had become something like family to Liam and me over the past 2 years, had mentioned in passing that Petty Officer Grant, one of my most reliable and discreet junior officers, was heading out to Chesapeake that same evening to help his own grandfather move furniture, only 2 streets from the Whitfields. It was a small, unremarkable coincidence. I filed it away and thought nothing more of it. I agreed to the dinner. One condition, I would stay the entire time. No dropping him off, no leaving him alone with them, not even for 20 minutes. Of course, Diane said, and I heard underneath the words the particular smoothness of someone already planning around an obstacle. The dinner itself was almost pleasant. Richard opened gifts, told old sea stories from his own brief stint in the Merchant Marine decades ago, and Liam sat quietly beside me, eating his chicken in small, careful bites, following his visual schedule taped discreetly to the inside of a folder I'd brought. For nearly 2 hours, nothing went wrong. Then my phone rang. Chief Petty Officer Reyes calling from the base, his voice tight. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt your evening. We've got a readiness issue on the material inspection paperwork for tomorrow's visit. The squadron commodore is asking for you directly. It'll take 15 minutes, no more, but it needs your signature tonight." 15 minutes. There was a small office down the hall in Richard and Diane's house, quiet enough for a call. Liam was calm, sitting with his tablet, headphones already on, his schedule card showing a picture of a house, meaning we're staying here for a while longer. "I need to take this call," I told Diane, my voice firm. 15 minutes. He stays exactly where he is, exactly like this. Do not change anything. "Of course, dear. Go. We'll keep an eye on him." I stepped into the office at the end of the hall and closed the door most of the way, leaving it open a crack out of habit, the way you never fully seal yourself off when your child is in the next room. I signed the digital form Reyes needed, confirmed the material inspection checklist, and the whole exchange took exactly 12 minutes. When I opened the door fully and stepped back into the hallway, the living room was empty. Liam's tablet sat alone on the couch cushion, screen still glowing, his headphones lay beside it. His blanket was gone. "Diane?" I called, my voice already sharpening into something closer to command than conversation.
Richard appeared from the kitchen, a dish towel in his hands, unbothered in a way that made my stomach drop before he even spoke. "He's outside," Richard said. He had one of his little meltdowns, wouldn't stop that awful rocking and moaning at the table, so we put him out front to cool down. Kids need to learn there are consequences. The dining room, where he had been eating quietly not 15 minutes earlier, sat undisturbed, his half-finished plate still on the table. There had been no meltdown at that table. I would know, because within the hour, I would watch the footage that proved it. I did not scream. 18 years of naval discipline kept my voice level even as my hands went cold. "You put my autistic 5-year-old outside? Alone? In the dark? He'll be fine," Diane said, emerging behind Richard, drying her hands on her apron with the mild irritation of someone being questioned about a minor household decision. "He has to learn he can't just fall apart every time something doesn't go his way. We locked the door so he'd understand we mean business. 5 minutes, Olivia, that's all." I was already moving past both of them, down the hall, toward the front door. The front door was locked from the inside, the deadbolt thrown, and it took me 2 precious seconds to work the lock while my hands, trained to remain steady during shipboard emergencies and general quarters drills, shook harder than they had in years. I got the door open and stepped onto the porch. That is the moment I described at the very beginning. Liam on the cold concrete, knees pulled to his chest, his blanket wrapped around his small shoulders like the only shield he had against a world that had just proven, once again, that the adults in it could not be trusted to keep their word. "Mama, cold, sorry." I dropped to my knees in my good church clothes, not caring about the cold seeping through the fabric, and pulled him against me. His whole body trembled, not from a tantrum, but from actual cold, actual fear, actual dysregulation that no amount of learning a lesson was ever going to fix, only worsen. "You never have to be sorry," I whispered into his hair. "Never. Do you hear me? You did nothing wrong." Behind me, the door opened. Richard stood in the frame, arms crossed, his expression somewhere between defensive and mildly put out, as though I was the one causing a scene. "You're overreacting. It's 52 degrees out, Olivia, not exactly a blizzard." "How long," I said, not turning around, still holding Liam, "was he out here?" 20 minutes, maybe. Diane checked on him." "I never checked on him," Diane called from somewhere inside, then immediately seemed to realize her mistake because Richard's jaw tightened and he glanced back at her with something close to panic. 20 minutes. A 5-year-old with sensory processing differences, no supervision, no coat, locked outside a house he trusted, on a night that was cold enough for his small body to shake uncontrollably by the time I found him. And that is when I looked up, past Richard's shoulder, and saw it. The small black rectangle mounted just above the doorframe, its tiny lens catching the porch light in a faint, glassy glint. The doorbell camera, Richard's $200 squirrel deterrent. It had a clear line of sight to the exact spot where Liam had been sitting. It had been recording the entire time. I didn't say anything about the camera that night. I have spent 18 years learning that the person who reveals their evidence too early loses their advantage, and some instinct, cold and clear beneath the fear for my son, told me this was not the moment to announce what I knew. I carried Liam to the car, wrapped him in the spare fleece blanket I kept in the trunk for this kind of unpredictable Virginia weather, and drove home with the heater on high and his hand gripped tightly in mine at every red light. He fell asleep before we reached the highway, exhausted in the particular way that comes after a body has spent too long fighting to regulate itself. At home, I put him to bed with his weighted blanket, his nightlight, his noise machine playing the ocean sounds he loved. I sat on the floor of his room for 20 minutes after he fell asleep, just watching him breathe, the way I used to watch Marcus sleep before a deployment, memorizing the shape of someone I was terrified to lose. Then I opened my laptop. I remembered, with sudden and complete clarity, a conversation 6 months earlier, at that same barbecue where Richard had bragged about his camera. He had shown me the app on his phone, proud of the cloud storage plan he'd purchased, 30 days of continuous footage, motion-triggered clips saved automatically. He had shown me specifically because he wanted me to know he could see who was coming and going from his property. I did not have his login, but I had something better. Diane, months earlier, in a moment of grandmotherly warmth I'd almost forgotten, had added the camera's shared viewer access to a family device group so that she could show her sister in Ohio photos of the grandkids visiting. She had, in her carelessness, added my email to that same shared group, thinking it was simply the family photo album app, never realizing it also carried live and recorded camera access. I had never used it. I had forgotten it existed. I logged in with trembling hands, found the app still authenticated on my old tablet, and scrolled to that evening's timestamp. The footage was clear, in full color, with audio. It showed Richard opening the front door at 7:45 p.m., one hand gripping Liam's upper arm, guiding him out onto the porch, not gently, but with the brisk, irritated motion of a man handling an inconvenience.
It showed Liam, calm, not mid-meltdown, simply confused, asking, "Why?" in his small, clear voice. It showed Richard saying, audible and unmistakable, "You need to learn to calm yourself down without all this fuss. Sit there till you can act like a big boy."
It showed the door closing, the deadbolt turning. It showed Liam sitting down on the step, pulling his knees up, and beginning almost immediately the rhythmic rocking motion that was his primary self-soothing mechanism, not a tantrum, but a coping response to genuine distress, exactly as his occupational therapist had documented in writing in reports I had personally given both Richard and Diane to read. It showed him there for 11 minutes before Diane's voice was heard once, faintly, through the door. "He's fine, Richard. Leave him be. He'll wear himself out." It showed him there for a total of 23 minutes before I opened that door myself. There was no meltdown at the dinner table. There was no misbehavior that justified isolation. There was a grandfather who decided unilaterally and against explicit written and verbal instructions to punish a disabled child for the way his nervous system worked, and a grandmother who heard him crying in the cold and chose comfort of her own evening over the safety of her grandson. I sat in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night in my navy dress uniform I still hadn't changed out of and watched the footage 4 times, my officer's mind doing what it had been trained to do for 18 years, separate emotion from evidence, build the timeline, identify every piece that would matter later. Then I downloaded every second of it, backed it up to 3 separate locations, and began drafting an email to my son's developmental pediatrician, Dr. Naomi Chen, requesting an emergency consultation to document any regression Liam might show in the coming days. I did not know yet how far Richard and Diane would go to protect themselves once they realized what I had. I did not know that this footage would eventually sit on a table in front of a family court mediator, a child protective services caseworker, and, unexpectedly, a Navy JAG officer who would become the reason none of them could talk their way out of what they had done. I called Diane the next morning, my voice level, my questions specific. "I need you to tell me the truth. Was Liam having a meltdown at the dinner table before you put him outside?" A pause, half a second too long. He was getting worked up, yes, rocking, moaning. Was he at the table when this happened, or had he already finished eating and moved to the couch with his tablet and headphones? Another pause. I don't remember the exact. I have footage, Diane. Silence stretched across the line long enough that I could hear, faintly, Richard's voice in the background asking what was wrong. "What footage?" Richard finally said, her tone gone flat and careful. "Richard's doorbell camera. 23 minutes of my son sitting alone outside in the cold, calm, confused, asking why, while Richard tells him to act like a big boy. It's time-stamped, it's clear, and it directly contradicts what both you and Diane told me last night." "You had no right to look at that." Richard's voice broke in. He had grabbed the phone. "That's my private property." "I added you to the shared viewing group 8 months ago. I have every right to see footage of my own child on your property, especially footage documenting exactly what happens to him when I'm not there to protect him." "This is exactly the kind of thing your husband warned us about," Richard said, and something in his tone shifted, a warning shot fired to see if it would land. "He used to say you were too soft on that boy, too much therapy talk, not enough discipline. Marcus would never have let this go this far." I stood very still in my kitchen. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes over me in moments of extreme emotion, a stillness I learned during my first underway watch as an ensign when the ship's systems were failing, and the only thing that mattered was not letting my voice shake. I used that stillness now. "Do not," I said,
invoke my dead husband to justify locking his son outside in the cold. Richard did not apologize. Instead, he pivoted, the way people do when they sense the ground shifting beneath a story they've told themselves for years. We're his grandparents. We have rights too. If you try to cut us out of his life over one bad evening, we'll fight you on it. We know people. Richard's brother is a family law attorney in Richmond. Did you know that? We could make this very difficult for you. There it was. Not an apology, a threat. I ended the call without responding to it because I had already learned, across 18 years of command, that the moment someone threatens you with a lawyer, the correct response is not more words. It is documentation. That week, I did 4 things, methodically, the way I would approach any operational problem with incomplete information and a ticking clock. First, I took Liam to Dr. Chen, who documented in his chart the specific behavioral regression she observed: increased nighttime waking, a return to hand flapping he had mostly overgrown, a new and specific fear of closed doors he had never shown before. She noted in careful clinical language that this pattern was consistent with a traumatic isolation event. Second, I contacted a family law attorney myself, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Cole, who had handled 2 other cases for military families dealing with grandparent visitation disputes. She reviewed the footage, the pediatrician's notes, and my written record of every prior instruction I had given Richard and Diane about Liam's care. This isn't ambiguous, Patricia told me, across her cluttered, downtown Norfolk office, sunlight cutting hard lines across case files stacked on every surface. You have documented repeated instructions they ignored. You have video evidence of a 5-year-old with a diagnosed disability being left alone outside in cold as punishment for a behavior that didn't even occur. This is not a custody issue between you and them. They have no custodial rights to begin with. But if they escalate, if they attempt to file for grandparent visitation rights against your wishes, this footage becomes exactly the evidence a judge needs to deny them permanently.
Third, I reported the incident to Child Protective Services myself, before Richard and Diane could attempt to preempt me with some distorted version of events. I sat across from a caseworker named Angela Ruiz in a small municipal office that smelled like burnt coffee, and I played the footage on my tablet while she watched, her expression tightening with each passing minute. "This is clear," Ruiz said quietly when it ended. "I'll need to interview the grandparents and your son separately as part of our process, but Commander Morgan, I want to be direct with you. This footage alone would support significant findings against them." Fourth, and this was the piece I hadn't planned for, the piece that would end up mattering more than anything else, I mentioned the entire situation, almost in passing, to my squadron's staff judge advocate during an unrelated meeting about an unrelated administrative matter. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitlock had handled 2 prior family law referrals for sailors under my command, and something about the specific cruelty of the story, an enabled child locked outside by his own grandparents, caught her attention in a way that went beyond professional courtesy. "Send me what you have," she said. "Off the record for now. I want to understand the full picture." I did not know it yet, but Lieutenant Commander Whitlock had, 6 years earlier, prosecuted a case involving elder financial exploitation that had, through a strange and specific coincidence of small legal communities, brought her into professional contact with Richard's own brother, the very family law attorney he had threatened to use against me. 2 weeks after the incident, Richard followed through. Patricia Cole called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular calm she used before delivering unwelcome news. "They've filed for grandparent visitation rights, formal petition through Richard's brother's firm. They're asking the court for guaranteed unsupervised overnight visits, twice monthly, arguing that you are unreasonably restricting Liam's relationship with his extended family following the death of his father." I sat very still, the phone against my ear, staring out my kitchen window at the small backyard where Liam's swing set stood, quiet and empty in the afternoon light. "I'm going to argue I'm punishing them," I said, "for one bad night out of spite." "They're going to try," Patricia said. "But Olivia, I've reviewed their petition. It doesn't mention the doorbell footage at all. I don't think they realize how much detail is on it, or that CPS already has a copy. I think Richard believes this is still a case of your word against theirs." That was the moment I understood with total clarity that Richard and Diane had spent 2 weeks constructing a story in which I was the unreasonable one, the overprotective mother who had overreacted to a minor disciplinary moment, and they intended to tell that story in front of a judge who had never seen the footage that proved otherwise. They did not know what was coming. The mediation hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks out, in a modest conference room at the Chesapeake Courthouse Annex, rather than a full courtroom, since grandparent visitation petitions in Virginia are typically handled through a less formal process before ever reaching a contested trial. Present would be Richard, Diane, their attorney, a tall man in an expensive gray suit, who projected the specific confidence of someone who had already decided he would win. I sat beside Patricia Cole, my dress blues traded for a simple charcoal suit, my hands folded, my expression carefully neutral. Lieutenant Commander Whitlock sat one seat down, present not as an advocate, this was outside her official Navy role, but as she'd explained to the mediator beforehand, as a subject matter resource on child welfare documentation standards, invited at Patricia's request, given her relevant expertise. Richard's attorney opened smoothly. "Our clients are devoted grandparents who have been unreasonably cut off from a grandchild they love, following a single incident that has been significantly mischaracterized." The mediator, a measured woman named Judge Pro Tem Carla Reyes Whiteman, nodded and turned to me. "Commander Morgan, would you like to respond?" "I would, but I'd prefer to let the evidence speak first." I nodded to Patricia, who connected her laptop to the small screen mounted on the conference room wall. Richard's confident posture did not change at first. Diane glanced toward her husband, a small, unconscious motion, the first crack in the surface.
The footage began to play. 7:41 p.m., Richard's hand on Liam's arm, guiding him firmly out the door. "You need to learn to calm yourself down without all this fuss. Sit there till you can act like a big boy." The deadbolt turning. Liam, alone, rocking on the step, asking in his small, clear voice, "Why?" Diane's attorney shifted almost imperceptibly in his seat. Richard's jaw tightened. The footage continued. 11 minutes. Diane's voice, faint through the door. "He's fine, Richard. Leave him be. He'll wear himself out." 23 minutes. The door opening. My own voice on the recording, sharp with fear, asking where my son was. The video ended. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield," Judge Reyes Whitman said, her voice carefully even, "your petition states that Mrs. Whitfield checked on the child, quote, every few minutes during this incident. Would either of you like to address the discrepancy between that statement and what we've just seen?" Diane's face had gone pale. Richard's confidence, the same confidence I had watched him wield across 2 years of dismissing my instructions, cracked visibly for the first time. "He wasn't in any real danger," Richard said, his voice louder than necessary, the tone of a man trying to regain ground that had already collapsed beneath him. "It was 52 degrees. Children have sat outside for worse throughout human history. My father sat me on a porch for far longer, and I turned out fine." "Your father's methods," I said quietly, "are not the standard this court uses to evaluate the safety of a diagnosed disabled child." Richard's attorney attempted to redirect. "The footage, while concerning in tone, doesn't demonstrate actual harm."
Dr. Naomi Chen's clinical notes submitted as Exhibit 4, Patricia said, sliding a folder across the table, document specific behavioral regression consistent with a traumatic isolation event observed within 72 hours of this incident. Sleep disruption, return of self-injurious hand flapping the child had not exhibited in 8 months, a new specific phobia of closed doors. The mediator studied the documents for a long moment. Then she looked up directly at Richard and Diane. I have reviewed the CPS preliminary findings as well, which were provided to this mediation by consent of both parties' attorneys. Mrs. Whitfield, I want to be direct with you. The statement you provided to the caseworker that you checked on the child, quote, every few minutes, is contradicted by time-stamped video evidence showing you spoke through the door exactly once at the 11-minute mark and did not open it for the remaining 12 minutes despite audible distress. That is a significant concern, separate from the visitation matter at hand. Diane said nothing. Her hands, folded on the table, had begun to tremble slightly. Richard, still unwilling to concede, made one final attempt. We're prepared to be more flexible on supervision requirements if that would resolve. Mr. Whitfield, the mediator said, your petition asks this court to grant you unsupervised overnight visitation with a child you have just been shown on video isolating outside in cold weather as a punitive measure in direct contradiction of documented medical instructions provided to you in writing. I do not see a version of this mediation that results in that outcome today. What happened next unfolded slowly, like real collapses do, not in a single dramatic moment, but across a series of small, cumulative concessions. Richard's attorney requested a brief recess. In the hallway outside the conference room, I heard, through the door left slightly ajar, Richard's voice, low and urgent, arguing with his own brother. You told me the footage wouldn't hold up. You told me a 5-year-old sitting outside for 20 minutes wasn't going to be treated like some kind of... I told you, his brother said, his voice tight with the particular frustration of a lawyer watching a client ignore advice, that if there was footage contradicting your account, you needed to disclose that to me before we filed anything. You didn't tell me there was a camera, Richard. When the mediation resumed, Richard's attorney requested a formal withdrawal of the visitation petition, framing it carefully as a mutual decision to prioritize the family's healing process. Judge Reyes Whitman noted the withdrawal for the record, then addressed Richard and Diane directly one final time. I want to be clear about something. This mediation resolves the visitation petition. It does not resolve the separate matter currently under review by Child Protective Services, nor any question regarding the accuracy of statements made to that agency during an active investigation. Those are matters for a different process, and I would strongly recommend, Mrs. Whitfield, that you consult independent counsel regarding your own statement to the caseworker. Diane, for the first time since I had known her, said nothing at all. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the table, on her own trembling hands. The CPS investigation concluded 5 weeks later. Angela Ruiz called me personally to deliver the findings. The agency substantiated a finding of inadequate supervision and inappropriate disciplinary practice against Richard and Diane Whitfield, a formal record that would remain on file and would be considered in any future matter involving their contact with minors. Diane's false statement during the investigation was referred separately to the Commonwealth's office for review. Ultimately, given her age, her lack of prior record, and the absence of intent to cause the underlying harm itself, she was offered a deferred disposition contingent on completing a court-monitored program, rather than formal prosecution, a resolution that felt to me less like triumph and more like a quiet, sobering weight settling over the family I had married into. Richard, for his part, never fully apologized. Some people are constitutionally incapable of the specific humility that real accountability requires. What he offered instead, months later, at a stiff, carefully arranged meeting in a neutral cafe that Patricia had suggested as a way to allow limited, fully supervised contact if I chose to permit it, was closer to an explanation than an apology.
I didn't understand, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. what he actually needed. I thought I was helping him toughen up. I didn't think it through the way you have to think it through. It was not enough. It would never be entirely enough. But it was, I understood, as close to honesty as Richard Whitfield was capable of reaching, and I chose, eventually, to allow brief, fully supervised visits, always in public settings, always with Liam's schedule and sensory needs explicitly honored and monitored by either myself or, on occasion, Senior Chief Alvarez's wife, who had become something like an honorary aunt to Liam over the preceding year. Diane took longer. Her program required her to attend sessions specifically focused on disability awareness and child development, and 6 months in, she called me, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "I read through the research they gave us," she said, "about what a meltdown actually is versus what I thought it was. Olivia, I didn't know. I want you to know I didn't understand what I was looking at when he was rocking like that. I thought he was being defiant. I didn't think it through the way you have to think it through." It was not enough. It would never be entirely enough, but it was, I understood, as close to honesty as Richard Whitfield was capable of reaching, and I chose, eventually, to allow brief, fully supervised visits, always in public settings, always with Liam's schedule and sensory needs explicitly honored and monitored by either myself or, on occasion, Senior Chief Alvarez's wife, who had become something like an honorary aunt to Liam over the preceding year. Diane took longer. Her program required her to attend sessions specifically focused on disability awareness and child development, and 6 months in, she called me, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "I read through the research they gave us," she said, "about what a meltdown actually is versus what I thought it was. Olivia, I didn't know. I want you to know I didn't understand what I was looking at when he was rocking like that. I thought he was being defiant. I didn't think it through the way you have to think it through." Understanding, arriving 8 months too late, does not undo 23 minutes on a cold porch. But it is not nothing either, and I have learned across 18 years of watching people fail and occasionally, painstakingly grow, that the second thing matters, even when the first thing cannot be erased. Liam is 6 now. He still has his blue blanket, though it has been mended twice at the seams by a Navy spouse in my squadron who does beautiful, careful needlework and refused to accept payment for it. He no longer flinches at closed doors, though it took 4 months of consistent, patient work with Dr. Chen and his new occupational therapist, a gentle process of showing him over and over that doors closing did not mean he would be left alone. Last month, at his kindergarten's spring assembly, Liam stood at the front of his small classroom wearing the noise-canceling headphones his teacher now keeps on hand for exactly these moments, and read aloud, in his careful, deliberate voice, a short poem about the ocean, about his father's photograph on his nightstand, about Mama's boat that keeps everyone safe. I sat in a folding chair in that gymnasium, in my dress uniform because I had come directly from the base, and I did not manage to keep the tears from falling, not once, not even trying. Lieutenant Commander Whitlock came to that assembly too, at my invitation, sitting beside Senior Chief Alvarez, both of them clapping harder than any of the other parents when Liam finished. It had become, somewhere across the past year, something more than a professional relationship. Whitlock had stayed involved in ways that went beyond what her role required, checking in, offering guidance when Richard and Diane's supervised visits needed renegotiating, standing beside me at a second, smaller mediation session when Richard briefly attempted to challenge the supervision terms 6 months after the first. She had told me once, quietly, over coffee near the base, that she had a nephew with autism, and that something about Liam's case had simply refused to leave her alone once she'd seen the footage. "You could have handled this without me," she said, that afternoon after the assembly. "You had the evidence, you had Patricia, you would have won regardless."
Maybe, I said, but you made sure the right people saw it at the right time. You made sure this wasn't just my word against theirs in some quiet room nobody outside the family would ever hear about. That mattered. She smiled, the particular smile of someone who has spent a career doing quiet, necessary work that rarely gets acknowledged. That's the job. I think back sometimes to that porch, the flickering light, Liam's small voice apologizing for being cold. I think about how close I came to believing, for years, that keeping the peace with difficult family members mattered more than trusting the instinct that told me something was deeply wrong. The camera did not create the truth that night. Richard and Diane created it, in the choices they made while they believed no one was watching closely enough to hold them to account. The camera only refused to rewrite it afterward. Liam does not remember much about that night anymore, and I am grateful for that small mercy of a 5-year-old's memory. What he remembers, when I ask him gently months later, is simpler than I expected. "You came and got me," he said, holding his mended blue blanket, looking up at me with his father's steady gray-blue eyes. "You always come and get me." "Always," I told him, "every single time. That's the whole job, buddy. That's the only job that's ever mattered." Outside our own front door, we have a doorbell camera too, installed the week after that mediation, not because I distrust the world entirely, but because I have learned, in the hardest way a mother can learn anything, that the truth deserves a witness, even when, especially when, the people who should protect a child choose instead to fail him. The porch light on our house never flickers. I make sure of that myself, every single evening before I lock the door behind us, together, safe, inside.